Let's talk about why people in the United States became interested in environmental issues and how this arose. And a lot of how this came to be was through several very significant environmental disasters that happened in the United States and around the world. So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk with you about what some of those were. And you'll also see that in this video, there are some links to some YouTube resources. So whenever you see that, I'd like you to pause my video and then watch that YouTube resource and then come back to this lesson. So in the past in the United States, hazardous waste was managed just like solid waste. And really, before the 70s, most waste was simply dumped or buried in drums and fields, released to waterways, or burned or incinerated without any controls, just to get rid of it. There were no regulations governing hazardous waste disposal. Hazardous waste was treated just like solid waste. Nobody understood that there were really two different types of waste. Regular everyday refuse that we might throw away, like paper and food waste and things like that. And then significantly hazardous waste like chemicals. So without understanding that, this led to some very damaging and notorious hazardous waste incidents. The first one that I want to talk with you about was the Love Canal. So this happened in upstate New York. There was a canal that was originally built in the early 1900s by a man named William T. Love, and it was built on the eastern side of Niagara Falls. He had a plan to build a small canal that would connect the upper and lower Niagara rivers and provide power to the community. And he thought this was going to be this beautiful dream community. So he started by digging the canal. He didn't actually finish the canal. And then in the 1920s, after alternating current was invented and it could carry electricity across long distances, and the stock market crashed in 1929, the project was stopped and the canal was abandoned. So now there was this big empty hole in the ground, and that was purchased by the Hooker Chemical Company. So the Hooker Chemical Company used that canal as a disposal site from 1947 to 1953. They buried an estimated almost 20,000 metric tons of chemical waste in the canal. There was no lining or anything. It was just placed in the canal, and it was placed mostly in 55-gallon drums. So once the canal was full, the Hooker Chemical Company covered it with dirt, and then they sold that land to the municipality for $1. In the late 1950s, about 100 homes in a school were built on the canal site, and people started realizing that people in the community were getting really sick. There was a high birth defect rate, and they started seeing some chemicals leaching into their basements and other significant problems. So in 1978, the site was evacuated and cleanup began. So I'd like you now to pause this video and take a moment to watch this attached YouTube resource. It's a really interesting New York Times piece about the Love Canal problem. And then once you watch that, come on back to this video. All right, welcome back. Now let's talk about another big incident that happened in Bhopal, India. So this incident occurred on December 3rd, 1984. There was a Union Carbide pesticide plant, and there was this huge industrial accident that was caused by poor maintenance and poor managerial decisions at the plant. And it caused approximately 15 metric tons of methyl isocyanate to leak into the air. MIC is super reactive and very, very toxic, and it produced this huge vapor cloud over the city of Bhopal. There were no emergency plans to deal with this in the city, and all of the emergency plans that the plant had were either not adequate or they failed. Several thousand people were killed immediately, and up to approximately 10,000 people died from results of the exposure at that site. There was an estimated 50 to 500,000 people that were injured, and we are still seeing the effects of this disaster today. It's very, very sad. So the valve that caused the leak should have been protected by several safety devices. But as I said before, poor maintenance and poor managerial decisions resulted in a failure of all of those safety devices, which ended up killing people. So I'd like you to take a minute to pause this video and watch this awesome National Geographic documentary about the Bhopal disaster. Just a heads up that this movie is an hour long, so you do need to be able to set aside some time to dedicate to learning about that. Once you're done, please come back and we'll continue with this lesson. All right, welcome back. I want to talk about another big issue that happened in the United States, and this was the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio. So on June 22nd, 1969, there was a lot of oil and debris sitting on the top of the river. It collected on the surface of the river, kind of got stuck under a railroad bridge and was ignited, and the river itself caught on fire. So Time magazine published pictures of this river on fire, and it shocked people because they couldn't imagine something like this could have ever happened. And that kind of led to the development of the Clean Water Act. Now, each one of these incidents that I've talked about led to an important environmental regulation, because it was these big issues that made people realize that we needed to do something and change the way that we were treating the environment and treating our hazardous waste. So once again, please pause this video and take a minute to watch the attached resource about the Cuyahoga River fire. All right, welcome back. We're going to talk about one more big environmental issue, and this was the Valley of the Drums site. So this happened in Kentucky, and so there was a site that was privately owned by a man named A.L. Taylor. And from 1967 to 1977, he operated an unpermitted hazardous waste disposal site on his property. He dug a lot of pits on the ground and emptied the contents of those pits into drums. He emptied the contents of drums into those pits and then recycled the drums. So the soil from nearby hillsides was then used to cover up the pits. He also would sometimes burn solvents on his site. And then later on, after he stopped digging pits, he was just storing the drums on the site without any containment, just placing the drums on the site. So in 1979, there was an initial drum inventory that was conducted, and it showed that 17,051 drums were on the surface of the site, and of those drums, 11,628 were empty. So on any environmental cleanup, finding a drum is really bad. Finding an empty drum is even worse. Because when you find an empty drum, that means that most likely the contents of that drum leaked out into the soil. They also found several disposal pits, and so they had to conduct all sorts of investigations to try to figure out where waste was buried, and what types of contamination were there. Many different types of hazardous substances were found on this site, including heavy metals, ketones, phthalates, PCBs, and all sorts of other bad things. So all in all, approximately 140 compounds on the site were identified, and you can see this long list of bad actors that were found on the site. As you can imagine, the cleanup of the site was really complicated, cost a lot of money, and took a really long time.